Two bridges sit over the same river tonight. One is old, crowded, and straining under the weight of an economy that moves faster than its concrete can handle. The other is brand new, 8 lanes wide, engineered to carry the future of North American trade for the next 60 years. It's finished, the concrete is dry, the lighting is installed, the ribbon is practically cut, and yet it may never open. Because at 3 o'clock in the morning, a single post from the President of the United States turned that bridge from a symbol of partnership into a pressure point. Not a tariff, not a speech, a threat to simply not show up. No border agents, no staffing, no opening. Billions of dollars in trade held hostage by empty booths. The question isn't whether the bridge is ready. The question is who blinks first. And what happens to your gas prices, your grocery bill, and the auto plants across the Midwest if nobody does? Hi, I'm Susan, and if you follow this channel, you know we don't chase noise, we follow leverage. What just happened between Washington and Ottawa isn't political theater. It's a high-stakes economic standoff playing out in real time, and most headlines are missing the real story. This isn't about concrete and steel. It's about supply chains, energy corridors, and a quiet counterpunch that Wall Street understood within minutes. In the next few minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what the White House did, why the Gordie Howe Bridge matters far beyond Detroit, and the one sentence from Prime Minister Mark Carney that may have completely flipped the balance of power. Because while one side thought it was locking a gate, the other may be holding the switch to something much bigger. Here's what actually happened. And it moved fast. A memo from the White House quietly instructed the Department of Homeland Security to halt all personnel transfers to the new U.S. Customs Plaza at the Gordie Howe International Bridge. That sounds technical, bureaucratic. But in plain English, it means this: no border agents, no inspections. No inspections, no traffic. And no traffic means the bridge does not open. It doesn't matter that Canada largely financed the $9 billion project. It doesn't matter that construction is complete. Without U.S. Customs officers in those booths, the span just sits there, gleaming, empty, unusable. And that's the leverage play, because the Windsor-Detroit corridor handles roughly 28% of all trade between the United States and Canada. On any given day, that's hundreds of millions of dollars crossing a single stretch of river. Auto parts, machinery, agricultural goods, energy products. But this isn't just finished products rolling across in neat little packages. Modern manufacturing doesn't work that way anymore. A single car part, a transmission component, a seat frame, a fuel injector can cross that border 5 or 6 times before the vehicle is complete. It moves back and forth as part of a synchronized, just-in-time system designed for speed, not delay. So when you threaten to freeze capacity at the busiest trade artery in North America, you're not just inconveniencing exporters. You're introducing stress into a system that was never built to absorb it. The administration's reported demands made the strategy clearer. Adjust Canada's dairy management system, block certain Chinese electric vehicles, accept a new per-truck security fee. The pattern felt familiar. Create the bottleneck, then negotiate its removal. A pressure tactic designed to force concessions under the clock of economic urgency. From a distance, it looks like strength, controlling the gate. But here's where the calculation may have gone sideways, because this time, the other side didn't panic. 3 hours after that memo leaked, Prime Minister Mark Carney's office released a statement. No dramatic language, no insults, no mention of the president by name. Just a single line that said the government of Canada is reviewing the operational status of energy infrastructure corridors in the Great Lakes region. That's it. If you weren't paying attention, you might have skimmed past it. It sounds like something buried on page 9 of a regulatory filing. But markets didn't skim. Traders reacted in minutes. And that's when it became clear this wasn't about the bridge anymore. When Carney referenced energy infrastructure corridors, he wasn't talking about symbolism. He was talking about systems, pipelines, transmission lines, the literal fuel that keeps the Midwest running. And suddenly the leverage equation changed. Because while a bridge controls the movement of goods, energy corridors control the movement of power, heat, gasoline, jet fuel, the underlying inputs that make factories run and homes warm in winter. This is the moment the standoff shifted from a border dispute to something much bigger. One side was betting on congestion, the other was quietly reminding everyone who supplies the tank. And the most revealing part, there was no shouting, no chest thumping, just a calm signal sent directly to the balance sheet. If you block our trucks, we review the flow of your fuel. That's not escalation for headlines. That's asymmetric leverage. And once you understand that, the entire story starts to look different. Because the bridge may be the headline, but the real battlefield might be underground. To understand why that one sentence hit so hard, you have to zoom in on the geography of this relationship. The Windsor-Detroit corridor isn't just busy, it's structural. Nearly a third of all trade between the United States and Canada funnels through that narrow stretch of river. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars every single day moving across a few miles of steel and water. And it's not random cargo, it's synchronized manufacturing. The auto industry alone depends on components that crisscross that border repeatedly before a vehicle ever rolls off the line. A part stamped in Ontario gets fitted in Michigan, sent back for calibration, returned again for final assembly. It's choreography, precise, timed, efficient, and fragile. If that flow slows down by even a few hours, assembly lines don't adjust, they stop. Workers get sent home. Suppliers stack inventory they can't move. Every delay compounds the next one. So when the White House signals that the new bridge, the very project designed to relieve congestion and future-proof trade, might sit idle, it injects uncertainty into the heart of that choreography. The pressure was supposed to land on Canada. That was the bet, that Canada, fearing lost export revenue, would move first. But that's only half of the system. Because trade is the visible layer, energy is the invisible one. And when Prime Minister Carney referenced energy infrastructure corridors, the most important corridor in that region immediately came into focus. Line 5. If you've never heard of it, that's the point. Line 5 isn't flashy. It doesn't make headlines unless something goes wrong. It's a pipeline that carries crude oil and natural gas liquids from Western Canada through Wisconsin and Michigan, feeding refineries in Ontario and, critically, supplying energy right back into the American Midwest. It provides a significant portion of Michigan's propane supply. It helps fuel Detroit's airport. It feeds refineries in places like Toledo that turn crude into the gasoline and diesel used across multiple states. In other words, it's not symbolic leverage, it's thermodynamic leverage. For years, there's been political tension around that pipeline, environmental concerns, legal challenges. Canada has historically defended its continued operation under long-standing treaty protections, arguing that uninterrupted energy flow is essential for both countries. Now imagine what happens if Ottawa simply changes posture, not with a dramatic shutdown announcement, not with a press conference declaring war, but with a review, a regulatory slowdown, a supply reassessment, a recalibration of export flows based on market conditions. You don't need to close a valve completely to create a shock. Even signaling uncertainty around supply can move markets. And that's exactly what happened. Energy futures reacted. Traders who live and breathe risk modeling recalculated exposure within minutes. Because if energy deliveries into the Midwest tighten, even temporarily, propane inventories shrink. Refinery output falls. Fuel prices rise. And they don't rise evenly. They spike hardest in the very states where economic stability is already politically sensitive. This is where the leverage math flips. A bridge can slow parts. Energy constraints can stall entire regional economies. One disrupts production timelines. The other touches heating bills, airline operations, trucking costs, agriculture, daily life. So when Carney's office mentioned energy corridors, it wasn't bluster. It was a reminder that integration cuts both ways. The United States buys Canadian goods, yes, but it also runs on Canadian inputs. And if you're watching this unfold and realizing how interconnected this really is, that's exactly why staying informed matters right now. These aren't abstract policy debates. They ripple directly into prices, jobs, and markets. If you haven't already, Make sure you're following along here so you don't miss how this develops over the next few days, because the next move won't just shape headlines, it could shape your wallet. Now, here's the critical part. None of this required a dramatic announcement from Ottawa. No ultimatums, no threats delivered with raised voices. Just a carefully worded signal aimed at the balance sheet instead of the news cycle. While one side tried to leverage a gate, the other hinted at controlling the fuel behind the gate. And once you see that dynamic, the market reaction starts to make a lot more sense, because markets don't respond to emotion. They respond to exposure. And exposure, in this case, runs deeper than concrete and customs booths. If you want to know who believes the threat is real, don't start with politicians. Start with traders. Within minutes of Carney's statement about reviewing energy infrastructure corridors, currency desks lit up. The Canadian dollar didn't sink under pressure. It strengthened. Not dramatically, but enough to signal confidence. At the same time, Midwest heating oil futures jumped sharply. That's not ideology. That's exposure management. When markets think a country is about to lose leverage, its currency usually weakens. When they think it controls a critical input, they price that control in. And energy is as critical as it gets. Bond markets also told a quiet story. Risk premiums shifted. Analysts recalibrated assumptions about supply continuity. Because here's the uncomfortable reality. In a fully integrated North American economy, energy isn't just a commodity, it's infrastructure. You can delay a shipment of auto parts and recover later. You can't run a refinery without feedstock. You can't heat homes in February on political messaging. Traders understand that. They don't wait for press conferences. They move when the math changes. And then there was something else, something quieter, but maybe more telling than any futures chart. Silence. Usually when a protectionist move hits the news, especially one framed as defending American leverage, major industrial unions are quick to react. Statements, applause, social media posts about protecting domestic jobs. This time, almost nothing. The Teamsters didn't erupt in celebration. The auto workers didn't flood feeds with support, because the Gordie Howe Bridge isn't a foreign giveaway. It's a pressure release valve for Detroit's auto industry. It's capacity, efficiency, insurance against bottlenecks that cost manufacturers billions when they hit. Automakers understand the fragility of just-in-time logistics better than anyone. They lived through semiconductor shortages. They absorbed pandemic-era shipping delays. They know what happens when a single artery gets clogged. So the idea of intentionally constraining new capacity at a time when competition from Mexico and Asia is intensifying doesn't read as strength inside those boardrooms. It reads as risk. And when industry leaders see risk, they make phone calls. This is the part most viewers never see. The back-channel conversations, the donor networks, the logistics companies calculating reroute costs, the refiners modeling supply gaps. Political leverage doesn't just operate in public statements, it flows through influence networks. If business leaders believe a policy move threatens regional stability, pressure builds quickly, quietly, relentlessly, which raises the bigger question: why escalate this at all? To understand that, you have to look at strategy. Historically, high-pressure negotiation has followed a pattern: maximize discomfort, wait for the counterpart to blink, accept a concession, declare victory. It's a tactic that works when the pain lands disproportionately on the other side. But in a deeply integrated economy, pain doesn't respect borders. It reverberates. Blocking a bridge in the modern supply chain era isn't like closing a gate in the 1980s. Today, that gate is embedded in software systems, procurement contracts, synchronized shipping schedules. You're not isolating a neighbor. You're disrupting a network that includes your own voters, your own industries, your own fuel supply. And that's why the silence from labor groups and industrial voices matters, because they understand something fundamental. The bridge isn't a symbol of Canadian advantage. It's a shared dependency. Shutting it down to gain leverage risks destabilizing the very workers and factories the policy is supposed to protect. Right now, the public narrative might frame this as a bilateral standoff. But beneath that narrative, the pressure points are domestic. Factory managers in Michigan, refinery operators in Ohio, logistics planners in Illinois. These are the people who feel disruption first, and they don't experience it as geopolitics. They experience it as halted production, missed quotas, rising input costs. And when enough of those stakeholders feel exposure at the same time, the center of gravity shifts. The question is whether that shift happens quietly behind closed doors or explodes into something much bigger. To understand how this spirals or stabilizes, you have to look at the psychology behind it. High-pressure political negotiation often runs on a simple algorithm: create urgency, escalate visibly, wait for the counterpart to concede, then declare victory. It's a tactic that has worked in trade disputes before, especially when the economic relationship is imbalanced. But the United States and Canada are not operating in a simple buyer-seller dynamic anymore. This isn't a factory in one country shipping finished goods to consumers in another. This is co-production, co-investment, codependence built over decades. The border today isn't a wall or a gate. It's a processing system, almost like a server in a shared network. Parts, data, energy, capital, all of it flows through continuously. When you disrupt one node, you don't isolate damage. You introduce latency into the entire system. And latency in manufacturing is expensive. If you block capacity at the busiest trade corridor in North America, you're not just inconveniencing exporters north of the river. You're slowing assembly lines in Michigan. You're complicating logistics in Ohio. You're squeezing suppliers in Pennsylvania. That's the paradox of deep integration. Leverage cuts both ways. And this is where timing matters. Inflation remains sensitive. Energy prices are politically radioactive. Manufacturing states are electorally critical. In that environment, escalation becomes riskier, because any disruption that raises fuel costs or stalls production doesn't land in abstract GDP charts. It lands in voter perception, which brings us to the other side of the table. Mark Carney is not a career retail politician. He built his reputation in central banking, managing financial crises, stabilizing markets, thinking in terms of systemic risk and cascading effects. That background shapes how he approaches confrontation. Instead of responding emotionally to a visible pressure point, the bridge, he reframed the battlefield around structural leverage, energy corridors, supply security, market stability. That's asymmetric escalation. One side targets a symbol that generates headlines. The other side targets a system that generates exposure. It's quieter, less theatrical, but potentially far more powerful. Notice what Carney didn't do. He didn't issue inflammatory statements. He didn't rally crowds. He didn't frame the dispute as a moral showdown. He issued a review notice, bureaucratic language that signals optionality. In financial terms, he widened the range of possible outcomes. And uncertainty, especially around energy supply, carries weight. Strategically, that move also shifts pressure internally within the United States. Energy producers, refiners, airlines, agricultural distributors, these stakeholders have skin in the game. If they perceive even a modest risk to supply continuity, they advocate, they lobby, they calculate worst-case scenarios and push for de-escalation. That's the quiet brilliance of the maneuver. Instead of confronting rhetoric with rhetoric, Carney redirected the stress into domestic economic channels. If escalation hurts regional fuel markets or industrial output, the pushback won't come from foreign diplomats. It will come from within. And there's a deeper shift embedded in this posture. For decades, Canadian leadership has often tread carefully in disputes, mindful of economic asymmetry and political optics. But signaling a willingness to leverage energy corridors suggests a recalibration, a recognition that integration provides tools, not just vulnerability. This isn't about hostility. It's about demonstrating that partnership requires mutual reliability. If access to trade infrastructure becomes conditional, so can access to critical inputs, not as punishment, but as parity. At this midpoint in the standoff, here's what matters most: perception of credibility. If markets, industries, and political actors believe both sides have real capacity to escalate, incentives tilt toward compromise. If one side appears bluffing while the other holds tangible supply leverage, the balance shifts. And this is where you come in. I'm curious, where are you watching from, and how would rising fuel costs or supply chain disruptions hit your region? Drop your location and perspective below. It's important to understand how interconnected this really is, because what looks like a border dispute on a map could ripple straight into your local economy. Right now, neither side has fully committed to escalation. The bridge is built, the energy is flowing, the system is intact, but tense. The next move will determine whether this becomes a brief standoff resolved quietly or the beginning of a much deeper structural shift in North American trade. And if that shift happens, it won't just change how goods cross a river. It could redefine how two countries calculate power in the 21st century. For most of the last century, Americans and Canadians operated under an unspoken assumption. The border was permanent, but frictionless. Different flags, different governments, but economically, culturally, strategically intertwined to the point of predictability. Trucks crossed, energy flowed, disputes flared and cooled. The system endured. That assumption is what's really being tested right now, because if a fully completed international bridge can sit idle over a staffing dispute, then the idea of the unguarded frontier is over. What replaces it is something colder: conditional integration, infrastructure that exists, but only functions when political alignment permits it. And that shift has consequences that stretch far beyond Detroit. If cross-border capacity becomes politicized, businesses respond by diversifying. Companies invest elsewhere. Supply chains reroute. Redundancies get built, not for efficiency, but for resilience. That means higher long-term costs. It means price volatility that doesn't fade quickly. Cars assembled in North America become more expensive to produce. Fuel markets build in geopolitical premiums. Food distribution, especially in winter months, absorbs added transportation risk. But the deeper consequence is geopolitical credibility. If the United States struggles to operationalize a bridge with its closest ally during a dispute, allies further abroad take note. Reliability isn't measured only in defense treaties. It's measured in everyday coordination. Infrastructure cooperation is a signal of trust, and trust, once questioned, doesn't snap back instantly. From Canada's perspective, this moment may mark a strategic pivot point, not necessarily a dramatic break, but a recalibration. If access to U.S. markets becomes politically volatile, diversification becomes insurance. Europe, Asia, expanded Atlantic trade corridors, long-term supply contracts that reduce exposure to a single partner. None of this happens overnight, but strategic thinking often accelerates during moments of stress, which brings us to what happens next. There are three broad paths forward. The first is the quiet resolution. Behind closed doors, industrial stakeholders apply pressure. Auto executives outline production risks. Energy companies emphasize supply stability. Political advisors run polling models tied to fuel prices and employment. A compromise emerges. Perhaps minor concessions are reframed as victories. Public statements soften. Border agents are assigned. The bridge opens with minimal fanfare. Each side claims success. Markets exhale. Integration resumes, slightly bruised but intact. The second path is escalation. Rhetoric hardens. Staffing remains stalled. Executive authority expands the dispute. In response, Canada follows through on regulatory reviews tied to energy flows. Even limited constraints introduce supply uncertainty. Energy markets spike. Manufacturing output wobbles. Retaliatory measures cascade. What began as leverage transforms into a genuine trade confrontation. That path carries economic shock risk on both sides of the border. And once supply disruptions begin, reversing them isn't as simple as flipping a switch. The third path is structural pivot. Instead of focusing solely on immediate resolution, Canada accelerates diversification strategy. Trade agreements deepen elsewhere. Infrastructure investments shift toward transatlantic and trans-Pacific corridors. Energy exports rebalanced over time. The United States remains a major partner. But no longer the overwhelmingly dominant one. That's not an overnight divorce. It's a gradual reweighting, a hedge against political unpredictability. Right now, based on public posture and market signals, the first scenario appears most probable. Economic gravity still favors stability, but unpredictability is the wild card. Escalation often isn't driven by spreadsheets. It's driven by ego, perception, and the desire to appear resolute. And that's why this moment matters so much, because it's not only testing infrastructure, it's testing restraint. The bridge stands ready. The energy still flows. The system is paused at a decision point. If cooler calculations prevail, this becomes a case study in brinkmanship resolved quietly. If not, it becomes something far more consequential, a turning point where North American integration shifted from assumed permanence to negotiated access. The next 72 hours will tell us which direction history leans. There was a moment that captured the tone of this entire standoff. As cameras followed Prime Minister Carney leaving Parliament, a reporter called out a question about potential tariffs tied to the bridge. If the bridge opens quietly in the coming days, this episode will fade into a footnote. Analysts will reference it as a moment of brinkmanship that ultimately reinforced the importance of cooperation. But even in that scenario, something subtle changes. The assumption of automatic alignment weakens. Both governments begin modeling contingencies more seriously. Resilience replaces trust as the guiding principle. If escalation unfolds instead, the impact won't remain confined to policy circles. It will show up in refinery outputs, in propane inventories, in auto production numbers. It will filter into consumer prices. And once economic friction embeds itself, rebuilding confidence takes longer than triggering disruption. There's also the broader global lens. Allies and competitors alike observe how the United States manages disputes with its closest partner. Reliability is cumulative. Every moment of friction contributes to perceptions about predictability. In an era where supply chains are already being reconfigured for resilience, even temporary instability can accelerate diversification. For Canada, this moment signals a willingness to operate from a position of parity rather than deference. Not hostility, parity. A recognition that integration provides leverage as well as exposure. For the United States, it highlights the complexity of wielding economic tools in a system where domestic stakeholders absorb much of the shock. And for ordinary citizens, whether in Michigan, Ontario, Ohio, or Alberta, the consequences are practical, not abstract. Fuel costs, job stability, investment confidence, the price of goods that move back and forth across that river every day. Right now, the bridge stands complete, steel arching over water, lights ready, lanes painted, a physical reminder of how closely these two economies are tied together. Whether it becomes a symbol of renewed cooperation or a monument to miscalculation depends on decisions being weighed behind closed doors at this very moment. History doesn't always announce itself with grand speeches. Sometimes it surfaces in administrative memos, in subtle market shifts, in a single sentence about reviewing infrastructure corridors. We may be watching one of those moments unfold. The next update, whether it's a staffing confirmation, a policy clarification, or a further escalation, will tell us which path was chosen: stability, confrontation, or strategic realignment. Until then, the question remains: in an integrated 21st century economy, who truly holds leverage? The one who controls the gate, or the one who fuels the system behind it? For the United States, it highlights the complexity of wielding economic tools in a system where domestic stakeholders absorb much of the shock. And for ordinary citizens, whether in Michigan, Ontario, Ohio, or Alberta, the consequences are practical, not abstract. Fuel costs, job stability, investment confidence, the price of goods that move back and forth across that river every day. Right now, the bridge stands complete. Steel arching over water, lights ready, lanes painted, a physical reminder of how closely these two economies are tied together. Whether it becomes a symbol of renewed cooperation or a monument to miscalculation depends on decisions being weighed behind closed doors at this very moment. History doesn't always announce itself with grand speeches. Sometimes it surfaces in administrative memos, in subtle market shifts, in a single sentence about reviewing infrastructure corridors. We may be watching one of those moments unfold. The next update, whether it's a staffing confirmation, a policy clarification, or a further escalation, will tell us which path was chosen: stability, confrontation, or strategic realignment. Until then, the question remains, in an integrated 21st century economy, who truly holds leverage? The one who controls the gate or the one who fuels the system behind it? Canada exports energy, critical minerals, agricultural products. The United States provides scale, capital markets, and defense alignment. Each relies on the other in ways that aren't easily disentangled without cost. That interdependence is stabilizing until one side tests its limits. If the bridge opens quietly in the coming days, this episode will fade into a footnote. Analysts will reference it as a moment of brinkmanship that ultimately reinforced the importance of cooperation. But even in that scenario, something subtle changes. The assumption of automatic alignment weakens. Both governments begin modeling contingencies more seriously. Resilience replaces trust as the guiding principle. If escalation unfolds instead, the impact won't remain confined to policy circles. It will show up in refinery outputs, in propane inventories, in auto production numbers. It will filter into consumer prices. And once economic friction embeds itself, rebuilding confidence takes longer than triggering disruption. There's also the broader global lens. Allies and competitors alike observe how the United States manages disputes with its closest partner. Reliability is cumulative. Every moment of friction contributes to perceptions about predictability. In an era where supply chains are already being reconfigured for resilience, even temporary instability can accelerate diversification. For Canada, this moment signals a willingness to operate from a position of parity rather than deference, not hostility, parity. A recognition that integration provides leverage as well as exposure. For the United States, it highlights the complexity of wielding economic tools in a system where domestic stakeholders absorb much of the shock. And for ordinary citizens, whether in Michigan, Ontario, Ohio, or Alberta, the consequences are practical, not abstract. Fuel costs, job stability, investment confidence, the price of goods that move back and forth across that river every day. Right now, the bridge stands complete. Steel arching over water, lights ready, lanes painted, a physical reminder of how closely these two economies are tied together. Whether it becomes a symbol of renewed cooperation or a monument to miscalculation depends on decisions being weighed behind closed doors at this very moment. History doesn't always announce itself with grand speeches. Sometimes it surfaces in administrative memos, in subtle market shifts, in a single sentence about reviewing infrastructure corridors. We may be watching one of those moments unfold. The next update, whether it's a staffing confirmation, a policy clarification, or a further escalation, will tell us which path was chosen: stability, confrontation, or strategic realignment. Until then, the question remains, in an integrated 21st century economy, who truly holds leverage? The one who controls the gate or the one who fuels the system behind it?